Hello, History 362. So today I want to talk a little bit about institutions of Seleucid power, particularly the Seleucid royal court, and then also the Seleucid army, and hopefully we'll have time for both. So let's start with the royal court. And here, in some ways, the Seleucid court is not representative, but there are some things that all of the Hellenistic courts have in common. They are all institutions. I mean, we think about a court as physical space, and indeed, the Greek word for court is aule, the hall, the royal hall where the king and his courtiers gather. But really, it is a court is a sort of set of interlocking physical spaces and social constructs that allow a king to control the political class, the ruling class that he needs to govern. I mean, this is when we think about kingdoms. Kings need people. They can't govern by themselves. And so therefore, they need a ruling class that on one hand, they can trust with delegated responsibility. And in the Seleucid Empire, this is the most critical. Because remember, the Seleucids have to be able to give satraps armies and money and send them hundreds and even thousands of miles away and hope that they will remain loyal. So therefore, the court allows the king to control his ruling class in a way that he otherwise wouldn't if it was simply a bunch of sort of atomized lieutenants that he never sees. Now, many different monarchic societies have come up with a kind of court culture as a key solution to rule. And indeed, for those of us sitting here in 2020, the kind of dominant court culture, the one that sort of historians of Europe are most familiar with, is the court culture of Louis XIV, the Sun King, who creates a court culture, on one hand, a vibrant court culture around Versailles. But this is actually a way of controlling French nobles who, before Louis XIV does this, had previously simply been off in their estates, running their own things their own way, and bringing them to court and keeping them at court is the way that actually Louis XIV exerts control over his nobility, in many ways domesticates his nobility. Now, one weakness with the kind of using Louis XIV as the lens for how courts work, namely courts as an implement of power over your ruling class. I'm using ruling class, we could call them aristocracy, nobility, the people, the elites that you need to get things done. One downside of using Louis XIV as our role model is Louis XIV, famously, as an absolutist monarch, is a very strong king. And so therefore, a strong king who has both the brains and the kind of institutional brawn around him to truly govern in a top-down fashion is able to use a court as a tool of control. One thing that is important to note: weak kings can become captured by their courts. It can work the other way around. That is, a king can find himself so reliant on the courtiers who know how to get things done, and even so trapped in the kind of physical spaces. And remember, a king needs people as just a life support system, oftentimes maybe lower level people, but the people who are going to cook his food, open his doors, take out his chamber pot. These are lower level people who are on one hand intimately in control of the king's physical health, and also therefore potentially dangerous. And so indeed, a weak king surrounded by strong courtiers who may not know who's cooking his food, standing watch, coming in and out of his chambers, is on one hand potentially vulnerable. And even if the king isn't physically vulnerable by his court, the fact that the court can at times filter the kinds of information that comes to the king to create a kind of bubble around the king can allow strong courtiers, powerful courtiers, to work on weak kings. So the court, it can be a double-edged weapon for kings. Strong kings, smart kings, Savvy kings can use a court to control their ruling class. Weak kings can find the court, both its social constructs and even its physical spaces, being used to actually control the king. And I think I would think about that when we do our readings. You're reading your primary source readings for this week are about a moment when a sort of weak Seleucid king, a very young, fresh to the throne Antiochus III, how he actually transitions from being a weak king controlled by his courtiers to a strong king who is able to manipulate his court to get things done. This is a first step that's described by Polybius, who is quite likely using a Seleucid courtly history written probably in the Seleucid court and therefore interested in the at times violent dynamics of the court. Now, one key thing about the court is it is, because it's a set of social constructs, by and large, rather than a sort of series of titles or sort of administrative titles, bureaucratic titles, that's absent for the most part. There are a few, although even those are somewhat informal or vague. Courtiers, to be a courtier, of course here I'm using, again, a sort of medieval, late antique term, is to be a friend of the king. The court is full of the king's friends. And so the courtiers are friends, philoi, singular, one philos, many philoi, friends of the king. And that is, I think that, and actually the fact that Hellenistic kings, including the Seleucids, think about the court in terms of friendship, social access to the king is what gives you power, and also what gives the king sufficient trust to give his friends potentially important military or administrative commands. And also, at times, just a cut of the profits of empire, that to be a king's friend may be that the king randomly gives you gifts, he may grant you land, he may grant you favors, exemption from taxation. It's good to be a friend of the king because he's, the Seleucid king actually may at this point be the wealthiest man in the earth, technically, as someone who controls all of the revenues coming from this quite vast domain. So the court is full of friends. Now, there are a group of people who are sort of below the friends, who again are still part of the social network, and these are actually oftentimes referred to as parasites. The term parasite actually means someone who sort of dines along with, someone who's always trying to finagle a dinner invitation. And of course, it may be that the parasites are themselves either social climbers, they may be people who are there not because the king needs them as elites to rule his empire, but just because they're sort of funny and witty and he likes having them there. They may be people who again, have not yet become and maybe never will have the chance. They're not friends, but they're nonetheless there as a kind of social underclass in the court, which of course, once you're even in the court as a parasite of the king, you're certainly closer to power than the average person in the Seleucid Empire. And it's notable, a great deal of the activity in the court involves socialization. The Seleucids seem to continue the Macedonian tradition of heavy drinking in the court. And a lot of this social interaction is competitive. Indeed, we know that the way that sometimes people get recognized is by the fact that they manage to distinguish themselves in a kind of social interaction with the king. And then this leads to subsequent diplomatic or even military posting. So, for example, we're told that there is a poet named Hegesianax. There is a party, and Antiochus the Great, Antiochus III, wants people to dance. And it seems they may be performing a particular type of Pyrrhic dance, which is a dance that's done in armor. And so he tells this poet in court, saying, who again probably isn't a friend yet, may even be considered by many in the court a parasite. He says, "Why don't you dance too?" And supposedly Hegesianax, with great poise and verve, says, well, O king, why would I dance badly? I'm a bad dancer. But why don't you let me recite my poetry well? And of course, at this point, the king says, all right, brave words, give us some verses. And supposedly the poetry is sufficiently good that this leads to Hegesianax becoming a friend of the king. He gets promoted to Philos. Also, we later see, actually in a different source, Hegesianax has some important diplomatic missions. He's on embassies during Antiochus the Great's ill-fated, in the lead-up at least, to the ill-fated war with Rome. So here we actually have an instance of someone who distinguishes himself in the kind of competitive social setting. Everyone, including the king, knows that the jockeying is going on. He holds his own, and subsequently he's then given really deeply important diplomatic missions. So that's where we can see that the social world of the court directly impacts Seleucid military, administrative, and diplomatic functions. We do know that after a while, the title of being friend ceases to be informal. Indeed, it's quite likely not informal by the end of the 3rd century BC. Friends wear special clothing that marks them as friends. It seems with some kind of purple fixture. And indeed, in some instances, when a courtier is disgraced, or you can fall from friendship too, you can cease to be a Philos. We have records of kings walking up to a soon-to-be former friend and ripping off the clothing that signifies their status. One downside for Seleucid kings is that early on, and this probably is the case in, say, the court of Seleucus I or Antiochus I, the kings therefore have a lot of flexibility about who's their friend, because there isn't that status isn't institutionalized. Once it becomes institutionalized, though, in some ways this gives kings less flexibility. The friends have to really screw up to cease to be a friend. It's hard. You now can't just ghost your courtiers, which you probably could do. Our sources for these early reigns aren't great, but probably you could do that in the say 260s, and it seems like it's not. There has to be more draconian means taken to sort of dismiss a courtier. It also means that kings are quite likely inheriting a court when they come to power. That is, rather than just being an informal group of people that the king likes and trusts, kings, like new kings, including Antiochus the Great, which you're reading about in Polybius Book 5, come to power with a court already formed. The old king's friends are now the new king's friends, and that means that particularly in a moment of dynastic transition, the young king has trouble finding his footing because he's already inherited who his friends are, and now he has to figure out amongst those friends he's inherited who his true friends are. And you actually see that in your reading. And so that's something I'll let you kind of think about when you think about the dynamics of a young king getting the sort of feeling out the actual topography, human topography of his own court. Now, there are some more formal institutions within the, again, kind of world of friendship. The king will have a council, that is, some friends are going to be actually put on a royal council that he consults to help make decisions, and therefore being named to that council gives you additional power over just the random friend in court. The Seleucid kings and also Ptolemaic kings also do have the concept of a kind of first minister. So you'll sometimes see it translated as prime minister. That is a senior friend who is actually has explicit administrative roles and is actually seen as kind of the senior courtier or senior administrator of the Seleucid king. And that title is epiton pragmaton, the first kind of in charge of affairs or concerning affairs. So again, it's not quite like a British prime minister, but it is the friend who is the most empowered and probably is able to make some administrative decisions that the king simply sort of delegates onto. And of course, the power of the various men, epiton, pragmaton, will vary given also the relative strength of the king. So weak kings tend to have powerful prime ministers. Stronger kings have prime ministers who are more devoted to just doing what the king wants. I think that's where the actual sort of set of talents that the king has, his attributes, can matter a great deal. That's always a potential weakness of monarchy, is strong in Greek political theory. So strong kings can get a lot of great stuff done. Weak kings are pathetic, and it's bad for the whole system. So that is the Seleucid court. Now, again, one key thing about this court is the Seleucids do build palace complexes in the various cities. So that allows the court to move, but when it does move, there is a physical space where the king can inhabit. One thing that is notable is simply how often the king moves. In many instances, again, the court is with the king. In many instances, the court might literally occupy a set of military tents when the king is campaigning with his army. We do know that the king's tent is itself an important locus of not just decision-making, but also interaction between the king and his senior, not just generals, but senior sort of officers and courtiers, since many philoi are chosen to go on campaign with the king. I think I'm just going to limit this video actually to the court. One more point that I actually want to splice into the end of this video, and that is the Seleucids do maintain the institution of royal pages, basilikoi paides, that they inherit from the Macedonians. So that means that a number of young men, the sons of important aristocrats, are raised in the Seleucid court, oftentimes alongside the crown prince. And indeed, these are oftentimes referred to as the suntrophoi, the foster brothers of the prince. And indeed, it's not uncommon for, as the prince becomes a king and comes of age, that his suntrophoi will subsequently advance to important military or administrative commands. So again, in an ideal situation, he grows up with these young men, he learns to trust and work with them in the kind of competitive environment of the court, and then he has a cohort of men roughly his age that he can use as trusted officials. So another instance of where the social structures of the court subsequently map onto the political and administrative and diplomatic structures of the Seleucid Empire. All right, that's all for now. We didn't get to the army, but we will talk about next time the Seleucid army, a key form of royal power drawn from across the empire. I'll see you then.